Steve Olsen is currently serving as the Associate Managing Director for the Family and Church History Department. He has worked for church history his entire professional career, most recently as Acting Director, Museum of Church History and Art. In his current position, he oversees the operations and provides leadership for the Church History Library, Church Archives, Museum of Church History and Art, and Church Historic Sites. He is also an adjunct professor of anthropology at Brigham Young University. Service to the wider profession has included terms as president of the Utah Museums Association and Western Museums Association, and on the boards of the Charles Redd Center for Western States, Utah State Office of Museum Services, and the National Alliances of State Museums Associations. He has published widely in the fields of museum studies and church history, and frequently presents at scholarly and professional association conferences. He has a bachelor's degree from Brigham Young University and a master's and a doctorate degree in anthropology from the University of Chicago. He and his wife Kathy have 5 children. He served a mission to France and has held numerous ward and state callings, including bishop, high counselor, and gospel doctrine teacher. Let me mention, he will speak. We'll have volunteers with cards that they'll pass out, so if you have questions, just fill out your questions on the cards. Then we'll have volunteers go up and down the aisles, collect your questions, and he'll be happy to answer any questions that you might have. So with that, we're pleased to welcome Brother Stephen Olsen as our first speaker.
Scott, thank you very much. I've prepared my remarks with adequate time to answer questions or engage in discussion. So please feel free to raise any questions, challenge any of the assertions that I make, or engage in a number of other issues that I hope will be generated from my prepared remarks. There's a widespread public perception that the church archives is closed. At a point in the distant past, this rumor was true. This is actually a sign that was outside the church library when it was located in the administration building at 47 East South Temple. But fortunately, since that time, things have changed. In what follows, I consider 4 variations of this question in order to examine the nuances of the public perception. I will then summarize several initiatives of the Church History Department that address these and other concerns. Question number 1, is the public allowed in the church archives? The reading rooms of the Church History Department in the east wing of the church office building are open to the public from 8 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. Monday through Friday, except certain official holidays. This schedule corresponds with the hours that the church office building is generally open to the public. In addition, various historical databases can be accessed at any time at lds.org and josephsmith.net. As a record of our public service in 2006, nearly 50,000 archival items were circulated to more than 13,000 patrons, consisting largely of family historians, church headquarters personnel, and academic scholars. During the same time, our modest online databases received about 1 million hits. While the number of the visitors to the reading rooms in the church office building is not unusual for comparable research libraries, the disparity between on-site and online visitors suggests the potential of our serving in the future a much greater audience through the internet. Question number 2, are the collections of the Church History Department accessible? This question refers not to the location of the holdings or the hours of operation, but whether the collections themselves can be examined by the public. In order to address this issue effectively, we must first understand that virtually all collecting institutions restrict access to their collections to some degree. The level of restriction generally varies by type of institution. Collections in public libraries tend to be the most accessible, followed by those in special collections and academic research libraries. Private and corporate archives generally adopt the most restrictive access policies, and museums, for the most part, allow access only to their collections on public display. Because the church archives is more like a private or corporate archives, its collections are more restricted than those of a public or special collections library. However, the church archives makes a remarkable number of its records accessible to the public. In an effort to clarify its collections access policies, more than a decade ago, the Church History Department Administration clarified the criteria and procedure for gaining access to historical records. By policy, collections are publicly accessible unless they have sacred, private, or confidential contents. Let me explain briefly these criteria. Sacred. Like all religions that have a strong commitment to preserving their sacred beliefs and practices, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is obligated by sacred covenant to keep certain materials holy, particularly those associated with the temple. Private. Privacy is a legal category, and it recognizes that certain kinds of personal information, including health history, cannot be publicly divulged without the permission of the living individual to whom that information is associated. Confidential. Confidential records are those that relate to executive or proprietary church-related matters, such as minutes of presiding councils and proceedings of disciplinary actions. A formal review process assigns a level of access restriction to holdings that have sacred, private, or confidential contents. However, just because a record is restricted does not mean that access is impossible. Some restricted records may be accessed with the permission of authorized department personnel. So SPC policies and practices are periodically reviewed for clarity, consistency, and alignment. Question number 3, is the experience of visitors to the church archives productive and enjoyable? Visitor experiences at the church archives greatly influence their perception of its openness. So openness is not simply a factual matter, but it's an emotional quality as well. And it has been our perception that those who are the most critical of the church archives have never been there. By contrast, many visitors, and that includes many of you, have had rewarding experiences regarding its holdings. Effective finding aids, helpful user interfaces, a welcome setting, and even the secure environment of the reading rooms communicate a sense of permanence, protection, professionalism, and importance. Nevertheless, we recognize the need constantly to improve our performance in this area, particularly for interested patrons from throughout the world who will likely never visit Salt Lake City or church headquarters. Therefore, the experience of our online patrons must be as rewarding as that of our on-site visitors. Question number 4, are the holdings of the church archives relevant? Collecting institutions like the Church History Department may be open to the public at convenient hours and have liberal access policies and attractive public service programs, and yet not be compelling because few patrons care about the contents of their collections. This is the case with many special collections libraries or private archives whose collections are so arcane or narrowly defined as to be irrelevant to most ordinary people. Concern that archival collections of the church are not relevant to abiding public interests is the least of the 4 concerns I've addressed here. The comparable popularity of church history websites, suggests that the relevance of the collections is far less of a public concern than are the